things. But amongst these devotees that were living outside, there were those who had broken away from ISKCON and they'd concocted their own philosophy. And at the end of this evening class, some of their doubts were brought up at question time. Prabhupada very kindly allowed us to have some very lengthy question and answer periods at the end of these classes. One boy who was in this circle asked Prabhupada, he said, "Can you take initiation by accepting the spiritual master in your heart without actually taking?" And Prabhupada cut him off and said that these are all bogus propositions. He said, "It has no meaning. If you think in yourself that I'm eating," he said, "will you be satisfied?" He said, "You actually have to eat to be satisfied. If you just simply imagine that you've eaten, you will not satisfy your appetite," indicating that you have to physically take initiation from the spiritual master, not just take initiation in the heart. This, he said, was bogus.
At the end of the lectures, he would stop at the temple doorway and I'd put his slippers on his feet. And he would allow me to pick him up and he'd put his arm around my shoulder and I'd carry him up the stairs in Dank Street. Sometimes he would give me little comments on the way, just the two of us could hear. Other times he'd be very sober. But all the time, once we got past the doorway, I would get a little jovial comment of some sort. But the amazing thing was, I always never, ever, ever forgotten this point, that it always seemed to me as though he was weightless. There was no weight there at all. I could walk up the stairs with him easy, with just holding him, carrying him up. It was amazing how weightless he was.
We're sitting in Srila Prabhupada's room, not his bedroom, but his sitting room, where he would receive his guests. What you're seeing now is one of the lawyers we've brought up to speak to Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada wanted to talk with distinguished guests every night, and it was the duty of our advanced team to arrange for people to come and speak to Prabhupada. And finally we had our own building and a very elegant place to bring distinguished guests. People like the Archbishop of Melbourne and the Episcopal Bishop of Melbourne. Srila Prabhupada sitting on his elegant chaise lounge that we purchased at the antique shop. And we went overboard a little bit. We had it reupholstered in that powder blue color to match the walls, because we understood that Srila Prabhupada liked the blue and white and gold combination as his color scheme for his room. So Srila Prabhupada was speaking to the lawyers and explaining Vedic philosophy. They were very respectful. As you may know, in the beginning of Krishna consciousness in Australia, there was quite a struggle for proselytizing Krishna consciousness in the street. In Melbourne, where they had a very liberal-minded city council, they had a front of being very tolerant, but they really wanted us to get off the street. The people that had their big multi-million-dollar boutiques and stores didn't fancy the idea of the devotees being part of the landscape. So we hired this lawyer, Wally, for advice and what to do. And the city council would issue us these tickets. And we had received instruction from Prabhupada that we can chant in jail or we can chant on the street. It doesn't make any difference. So why waste our money on expensive lawyers? And eventually they'll see the folly in their persecution and leave us alone. And sure enough, that's what happened. So we never paid Wally a lot of money. And in fact, he donated his service mostly. And a lot of times we didn't take his advice either, because Prabhupada always took precedence. Well, the flower incident it's a famous incident in the history of Australia. And it revolved around our Rath Yatra festival. The Rath Yatra festival, which was held in Australia in 1973. Because Srila Prabhupada was there for Rath Yatra the year after, and then this conversation, which is taking place, happened in 75. During that Rath Yatra festival, some of the devotees got carried away with their gathering of flowers, and one group of devotees took off to the outer suburbs, and they broke into a greenhouse a professional greenhouse, and they volunteered all the flowers from that greenhouse to Lord Jagannath, which wasn't an authorized activity at all. But somehow or other, you know, thousands and thousands of carnations showed up on the morning of Rath Yatra festival. So we used them, and then the police came just before the festival was to begin, and it was almost an ugly scene. And one of the brahmacharis had to be sacrificed for the for the gallows. And so he sacrificed his freedom, and he said, I went and, you know, stole the flowers, I did it on my own, and so he spent the Rath Yatra day in jail, and the Rath Yatra festival went on. And we had to pay a fine and everything like that. So everything got resolved a whole year before. So the humor is that the devotees had purchased this new temple, and we wanted to have an elaborate greenhouse for the Tulsi plants. So the devotees who were helping to organize this temple weren't aware of what happened on the Rath Yatra festival the years before. So they were looking around for a greenhouse. So they thought, well, let's ask the guy about his greenhouse. And they were all dressed up like devotees and everything, very earnest. So they knocked on the guy's door, and lo and behold, it was the man who years before the devotees had stolen all his flowers. That was like the straw that broke his back. He flipped out, and he started screaming and yelling, and he drove them away. He said, get off of my property, I never want to see you again. So the lawyers had found out about that, and they were all laughing. And it all came up while Prabhupada was explaining how Krishna owns everything. So they were all having a good chuckle about that. So in that type of an atmosphere, Prabhupada was conducting these conversations every night. They usually go on for an hour or 2 hours, and then they would be given prasadam and treated very respectfully. And in this way, Prabhupada said we can establish good relationships with the respectful people of the city. And it actually worked, because when we were having all these difficulties with the police and city council in Melbourne, one year the Archbishop of Melbourne came to Srila Prabhupada, and the Archbishop was so impressed with Srila Prabhupada that he spoke from the pulpit the next Sunday saying that we should not persecute these Hare Krishna people, and we should let them go in peace. And the sermon was reported in the paper, on the Sunday papers, that the Archbishop had made this comment, and lo and behold, the City Council backed off after that. You know, came out in the paper that the Archbishop of Melbourne had given his stamp of approval to the devotees. So it was a great PR move on Srila Prabhupada's part, even inadvertently. But nothing was inadvertent with Prabhupada. He knew that, you know, Krishna was in control, and that he was doing his job, spreading Krishna consciousness, and everything else was going to just come out perfect.
It's going to be very hard to get to what you're
That
trying
is
for.
to be united first. That first thing is that everyone should be convinced or understand clearly that everything belongs to God. But they have no conception of God.
In his room, there's a chaise lounge, the French kind of seat Prabhupada sat on. So in that room, one morning, I had some duty to ask him something. I can't remember, but he was sitting on that seat. And when I came in, he was in some kind of spiritual experience with his eyes closed, and he seemed to be like hugging someone who I couldn't see. He was like moving his shoulders forward and just feeling these really intense feelings. And then after some time I didn't know what to do, so I was just sitting there, and then he opened his eyes and looked at me, and yes, and then I, whatever question, something about doing something by a certain time, I can't remember what it was just now. And he just answered, and then I paid my obeisances and left. That was very amazing.
There was the two solicitors, and the other guy with the long hair was the photographer that took the ad for the Wrangler shirts, which was that billboard ad that was around the world. The photographer's name was Bob Bourne, and He was a personal friend of mine and he won awards for that one photo. How it came about for him to do the Wrangler ad, we had just done the temple up in Burnett Street, and the deities have just been all clothed in new clothing, and Bobby had been decorating everything. And I organised Bob Bourne to come and take the photos of the deities for this particular time of their new dress. Bob had the Hasselblad camera, which is the one you viewed through the top, and he kept on referring to the deities as them and it, virtually, those. And one time where he was lining everything up and Barbie was just making sure that everything was in particular position for the photo, and it just so turned out that she walked out of the deity room and I walked out of the temple room. We were discussing something, and within seconds Bob came out and said she'd moved. We said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "She's moved, you have to go and straighten her up." And Radha turned. The deity moved. So Barbie had to go in and straighten her up again. So from that time on, he never referred to them as them or it. It was always Radha and Krishna. And after that, he wanted to do the photo for the Wrangler ad.
One of the nicest engagements I remember was when we went to Tarawara Abbey. It's a Trappist monastery up in Yarra Glen, up the back of Melbourne. And those monks were in silence up until the end of the 60s. So they were very strict, vegetarian. Like at the Franciscan monastery, Prabhupada spoke quite pointedly about not killing, which he tended to do around Christian people, because thou shalt not kill was the point at which he would enter the engagement with them. But at Tarawara he didn't. He spoke in a much more relaxed manner, and I never saw him so comfortable among men that weren't actually devotees. And there was a point in the evening where he was sitting on a couch and the monks were sitting around him, and he actually had his arm over the back of the couch around one of the monks' shoulders virtually, and he was sitting up, and when Srila Prabhupada was relaxed, he was extremely relaxed, but he had a very regal bearing. And like anyone who has a great regal bearing, when they relax, it's extremely attractive because it's intimate. It's not something that you normally get to see. Prabhupada's bearing in public was impeccable. And I very rarely saw him let that go and just relax. And I also saw in that moment how Srila Prabhupada was not sectarian. It was always about the principles. If the principles were being applied and lived, then he would embrace that in whatever form that took. And he had a remarkable way of speaking to that part of everybody. When you read the qualifications of a Vaishnava, always respectful to others, and you read those things and those words, you can take them superficially or you can take them very deeply. And in moments like that, I got to see very deeply what something like that really meant. The profound respect for the sincerity of those souls. And these monks put on such a feast for us. And they went to so much trouble, and he was so happy to see that and just to be amongst men who were trying to love God and were following some rules and regulations. I could see that he felt a degree of comfort and affinity that I never witnessed before or since. It was absolutely wonderful.
And similarly, one who is not a devotee of God, he has no good work. Because he will hover on the mental platform. There are different platforms. Bodily concept of life, general, and this body. Therefore, my business is to satisfy the senses. This is bodily concept of life. And others, they are thinking I am not this body, I am mind. Well, they are going on mental speculation, like philosophers, thoughtful men. And above that, there is intelligent class of men practicing some yoga. And spiritual platform is above that. First bodily concept gross, then mental, then intellectual, then spiritual. So this Krishna consciousness movement is on the spiritual platform, above body, mind and intelligence. But actually we should come to that platform because we are spirit soul. We are neither this body, nor this mind, nor this intelligence. So, one who is on the platform of spiritual consciousness, they have got everything. Intelligence, proper use of mind, proper use of the body. Just like a millionaire, he has got all the lower grade position, 10 rupees or 100 rupees, he has got all everything. You should see whether you are successful. And what is the standard of success? The standard of success is whether you have pleased God. You read this?
What is it?
Atha pungvi dijashreshta.
Atha
Pungvi.
Atha Pumbir Dvijasreshta.
Another word.
Atha Pumbir Dvijasreshta. Varnashram Vigbhagjaha. Svanus Isyasya Dharmasya Samsiddhi Haritosanam. O best among the twice born, it is therefore concluded that the highest perfection one can achieve by discharging his prescribed duties, dharma, according to caste divisions and order of life, is to please the Lord, Hari.
That is it. That should be it. So, whether by my profession, by my business, by my talent, by my capacity, there are different categories. Whether I have pleased God, then it is success. If you have pleased God by your legal profession, you are in a different dress, it doesn't matter. You are as good as they are wholetimely serving God. Because their business is also to please God. Similarly, if you have pleased God, then even by practicing your law, you are as good as the secular person. That should be the aim. Whether I have pleased God with my professional duty or occupational duty. That is the standard.
You could assume that whatever religion, if a person was religious,
Religion means God.
that
God is one.
that should aid all religions.
Yes.
And the more Christians there are, the more other religious people might benefit. Yet these
According to
can't see it.
Srimad Bhagavatam, religion means the law given by God. Just like law means the act given by the state. You cannot manufacture law, I cannot manufacture law. Everything is there. He must be at the same time, although he is hero, he must be generous. Just like Alexander the Great, perhaps you know the story, he arrested one thief. So when he was arrested and he was being judged by Alexander, the thief pleaded that what is the difference between you and me? You are a great thief, I am a small thief. So Alexander understood it and got him religious. This is generosity. He must agree to the principle.
Well, there's another one, the battle. Remember the big battle where the opposition, what was his name, was on the ground?
I told Wally the story that Abhimanyu was surrounded by the Maharathis. There was no mercy then. So now Karna was objecting that you cannot shoot a man if he gets off his chariot. And Krishna said there was no mercy with Abhimanyu, so therefore there will be no mercy now.
Tit for tat.
But where was the generosity then?
Now what that is happening? Tit for tat.
Was that generosity?
Huh?
Where was
No.
the generosity?
That,
Just times, Wally, surely. There's times for these.
that is war tactics. That is war tactics.
So he left about 20 people back at his house at some party. So he's feeling that he must have
It's
returned.
my father-in-law's birthday.
Oh.
And it's my son's 9th birthday.
Oh.
We decided we're going to have the family.
That's nice. Very good.
And then my wife said,
So give
this
some
is only
prasadam.
a couple of
Please,
nights
sir.
ago, my wife said, well,
Take some blessings from the temple
thank you
for
very
your
much.
son and
So
father.
we decided to get all of my father-in-law's friends. He doesn't know yet. And I'm supposed to pick him up, you see. You know, I'm supposed to pick him up half an hour ago. He just thinks it's a family dinner at home, you see.
Must go and
But by the time we get home, it's a surprise for him.
Yes. It is very nice. It is a very nice function. The father-in-law and the grandson. Yeah.
He's going to bring some prasadam for you.
Give some prasadam for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We invited everyone over to one Ukasrava's house one night. We had a big party, and Wally came and Raymond came, and they became very much addicted to prasadam.
Make his father-in-law also interested.
Well, he was here on Sunday.
Oh, yes.
He came down on Sunday.
So you are going? Thank you very much.
Thank
for
you
your
very
time.
much for your time. You've been most gracious and kind with us. Hope you have a nice trip.
He's coming back in January, too. Maybe then we can have a longer meeting.
Hey, it is a very nice place. I wish to stay here, but I've got so many branches, I have to go.
Good night.
Good night.
I think you must be very happy to see what's happened in Melbourne.
Yes, I'm very happy. This house is quite suitable for a partner.
They looked very hard for a long time
Yes.
and had a lot of difficulty.
Oh, yes.
This is one of the things that I imagine you know the story, but the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church owned this property, and it was almost by devious means that it was acquired.
They
Because
did
they
not want to give
didn't
us.
want to sell direct like that.
This is in the temple room of the Melbourne Mahaprabhu Mandir, and we're going to install the Gaurnitai deities. Now these are quite elaborate Gaurnitai deities. They were brought by the devotees from Navadvip, and Srila Prabhupada in the chatta there is bathing them. These were the largest deities that have ever been cast in Navadvip. They weighed hundreds and hundreds of pounds, solid brass. You know, you can see how tall they are. Prabhupada's standing one step below them, so they're quite tall. These thrones had been purchased by the devotees in San Francisco. They had been shipped all the way to San Francisco from Jaipur. Beautiful white marble thrones, but they were too small for the deities in San Francisco, so we had them sent all the way out to Australia, and they were assembled by the marble merchants who were installing the floor, the marble floor. They took time off and they put these beautiful white marble thrones together. And you can see even Gaura Nitai is a little bit too big for these thrones. Their arms stretch out underneath the archways, so they're not totally visible. But the official opening of the temple and the installation of the Gaura Nitai deities took place on the same day. And the devotees were quite ecstatic to have all this activity going on in one day. Bhai Bhavi was responsible for putting together the whole temple. She cast all the columns and they had the wrought iron gates made and designed everything.
And one day, Gaura Nitai arrived in 2 gigantic crates. Came in on a huge crane off the truck, manoeuvred into the Prabhupada house, as we called it, where they remained for some time while devotees made clothes and organised all the necessary what have you for their installation. It was a wonderful installation. Actually, before these deities were installed, I began making a small set of Gaura Nitai deities. We knew we were never going to be able to move these big deities again. We needed some small deities. They were made for the travelling Sankirtan bus, as Sabhabati Prabhu was organising at the time. Unfortunately, not being a Brahmin, I wasn't allowed to go and examine big Gaura Nitai, so I really just made it all up, how they had to look. But we just did it in the backyard of the temple. We bought a little bit of paraphernalia for the job, some fire bricks and some old vacuum cleaners to pump a bit of air into the fire. As the vacuum cleaners would melt, we would grab another one and turn it on. And they melted pretty quickly, because it was very, very hot. As we were doing this, we had the wrath carts parked right beside them, and there was devotees sitting all over the wrath carts watching this casting procedure underway as we were melting it and pouring it. They were cast metal and the bronze and the brass, and while they were being cast, we didn't have any gold, so certain of the ladies who were watching it were pulling off their wedding rings and throwing them into the crucible as we were melting down the metal, and that was very exciting. Deepak was handling the metal with me. It was something we'd never attempted before. We really didn't know where we were going or what we were doing with it, but we had a shot at it. This casting, the making of these deities, had transpired, must have been shortly after Prabhupada's visit. I imagine Prabhupada would have installed those too if he'd been there at the time. He was keen to make Lord Chaitanya available to everyone. Try to please Srila Prabhupada in this way. And it was all by his mercy that any of it was ever achieved, obviously. We certainly weren't going to be able to do anything alone or by ourselves.
The original deity was Radha Ballabha, marble deities that occupied the center altar. And then the year after that, the Jagannath deities were carved for the Rath Yatra, which Srila Prabhupada installed. And then the third year, when Srila Prabhupada opened up the new building, this is when Gaura Nitai was installed. And when Prabhupada installed the Gaura Nitai deities, he named the new temple the Melbourne Mahaprabhu Mandir. We practically outgrew the temple the day we moved in.
The purchasing of the Melbourne temple was a very big endeavor. It was very difficult for us to come up with the money. One devotee donated 10,000 Australian dollars, and that was the first deposit. But after that, the rest of it was 180,000 Australian dollars, and that was a lot of money back then. We had a very meager income, just people giving coins and notes on the street for books. And in those days, we didn't hire people to do things, so devotees, they personally renovated the whole surface of Prabhupada House. They scraped and plastered and filled on ladders and scaffolds all over the building, and the large temple room floor was laid with marble and onyx. And there was a very short time, and Prabhupada was coming. They actually arranged Prabhupada's visit to Perth for 10 days because the Melbourne temple wasn't ready to open. And when Prabhupada arrived, at one stage, Prabhupada, he actually said to Madhavisa Prabhu,